My wife's brother called me and said, "Your wife is a disgrace," and when I went to see her, I saw her in a restaurant with another man, laughing as if nothing else mattered. The world didn't stop, but my heart did. And that's exactly how it all begins, with the deafening silence of a love that dies without warning. I stood, a few feet away, watching the woman who claimed to love me cast a longing look at another man, while the wine flowed from her glass as if it were freedom, as if everything that existed before that was worthless. She tilted her head back, laughing at something he said, something I'll never know what it was, and her smile was the same one that had once been mine. And in that moment, it wasn't the betrayal that destroyed me. It was the ease with which she erased me from her life. As if I'd never existed. I turned away without saying a word. I didn't want confrontation. I didn't want shouting. I just wanted to leave with what remained of my dignity. I returned home with the firm steps of someone numb to grief, and left a simple note on the living room table: "I saw you. It's over." Nothing more. No explanation. No apology. Silence was the only thing fair in that moment. Because any word that came out of my mouth in that state would be accompanied by hatred, and I refused to let it take my peace too. As she said goodbye to the other man with a kiss on the corner of his mouth, I said goodbye to the man I had been by her side, someone loyal, someone who believed love was enough. In the following days, the phone rang. Once, twice, 10 times. She even showed up at my mother's door with puffy eyes and a prepared speech, saying nothing happened, that she was just a friend, that I'd misread everything. But you couldn't mistake the touch of her hands, the sparkle in her eyes, the absence of guilt. I knew her like the back of my hand. And there, before me, was a stranger. The woman who claimed to love me was now sleeping with a stranger. The same body I'd held for years, the same lips that promised me eternity, were now someone else's. And worst of all, she thought she could come back. As if love had a pause button. As if all she had to do was say, "I'm sorry," and everything would go back to normal. As if it were possible to betray someone and then return their heart as if it were an object that had fallen off a table and only had a scratch. She cried. A lot. She sent me long audio messages, short messages, flowers, and even a video reminiscing about our time together. But none of it touched me anymore. It was as if my heart had developed a thick scab, like a wound that closes for survival. And that's how I, little by little, began to rebuild myself. Not in a rush. Not with revenge. But with self-respect. I emerged from the pit she'd left me in and found sincere hands pulling me up. I found eyes that wouldn't look away when my phone vibrated. I found a hug that wasn't a temporary shelter. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Not euphoria, not unbridled passion. Peace. And this peace made me understand that true love doesn't shout, doesn't hide, doesn't feed on lies. It just exists. And that's enough. When she saw me again, months later, it was already too late. Her eyes searched mine desperately, and there, in the same restaurant where I'd last seen her, our roles reversed. Now she was the one watching me from afar, longing for what she'd lost. She approached, trembling, her voice breaking, and told me she'd do everything differently if she could go back. He said he still loved me. That he thought of me every day. That the other man was gone, that he regretted it, that it was all a mistake, a confusion, a moment of weakness. But what she never understood is that some choices cost too much. And that when trust is broken, love becomes memory. And memories don't embrace, don't warm at night, don't protect. They only hurt. I looked into her eyes calmly, with the serenity of someone who has cried all she had to cry, and said, "I forgive you. But we can't go back." And that was when she truly broke down. Because she realized that the love she thought was waiting for her was already gone. That the man she betrayed wasn't just a husband, he was the only one who truly loved her. And that the worst punishment in life isn't being hated. It's being forgotten. She tried to smile, but her face was covered in tears. And I just got up, paid the bill, and went home, to the home I built with someone who never had to lie to make me happy. Someone who loves me simply, who makes me coffee the way I like it, who listens to me even when I say nothing. And now, she's the one living in the past. Because the present no longer has room for her presence. But what she doesn't know, is that that day, in the restaurant, before turning my back and leaving, I hesitated. For 3 seconds, my hand trembled. My heart begged me to confront, to ask, to fight. But something inside me, maybe pride, maybe instinct, told me that if I loved myself as much as I loved her, I wouldn't stay. And if I had stayed, everything would have been different. Or not. And that's exactly why now, every night, when everything falls silent, one question comes back to haunt me. If she had seen me there, standing, looking, would it have been different? Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any type of betrayal. All stories told are fictional, but they reflect real pain, because there is only one truth: cheating destroys lives, corrodes love, and erases everything that was built on trust. Our goal is to show, with intensity and emotion, the bitter price of bad choices. Get ready, you're about to hear a shocking, intense and unforgettable story. They met on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that seems to slip away until the day something unexpected happens and changes everything. There was nothing grand about the setting: a street bookstore, the faint scent of coffee wafting from the cafe next door, a cloudy sky that promised rain but held back the drops as if waiting for the right moment to fall. It was there, between shelves of time-worn novels, that Daniel and Isabella's eyes met for the first time. He absently held a book about wine, while she searched for a poetry book in the same narrow aisle. The touch of their shoulders was light, but enough for them to look at each other and smile with that discomfort that comes with chance. It wasn't love at first sight, but there was something there. A natural kindness, a restrained charm, a silent curiosity that lingered in the air after each had gone their separate ways, books in hand, thoughts fixed on the other. The next time they met was also by chance, days later, at an outdoor music fair. Isabella wore a simple dress, her hair loose, and carried a bag of old vinyl records she'd bought for her father. Daniel, meanwhile, was with friends, drinking beer and laughing at some banal joke when he spotted her from afar. This time, he didn't let fate decide. He approached with a shy greeting and a joke about coincidences. They talked for hours, sitting on the grass, talking about everything and nothing, as if they'd known each other for a long time. It was easy to talk to her. And he, despite his initial shyness, had a genuine way of looking into someone's eyes, as if he truly listened to what the other person was saying. When they said goodbye, they both knew this was just the first of many goodbyes and reunions. Over time, what was once a light-hearted experience became a pleasant routine. They began sharing weekend breakfasts, lazy afternoons watching old movies, and long walks around the city discussing dreams, fears, things others never bothered to ask. Daniel worked in event planning. He was methodical, organized, and liked to keep everything under control, even his feelings. Isabella was the opposite, a visual artist, impulsive, intuitive, passionate about colors and people. Where he saw logic, she saw emotion. And perhaps it was this difference that brought them closer. She made him break out of the predictable. He made her feel safe. For a while, that was enough. When they decided to move in together, it was with the enthusiasm of someone who believes love can conquer all. They rented a small but bright 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood close to the things they loved. They decorated every corner with objects that told stories of their relationship. She hung paintings she'd painted, he tended the plants with dedication. Together, they built a simple life, but one filled with beautiful moments. The dinners cooked together, the silent Sundays with each reading in their own corner, the silly fights over who left the wet towel on the bed, all of this shaped the couple's identity. There was no excess, but there was care. There were no exaggerated promises, but there was presence. And in the eyes of friends and family, they were the kind of couple who seemed made for each other. Daniel was always discreet with his emotions, but observant. Isabella was an emotional roller coaster, intense, often confusing even to herself. He was the kind of man who wrote down dates, who remembered her favorite ice cream flavor, who noticed when something was wrong even when she said everything was fine. She was the kind of woman who made surprises, who wrote love notes hidden around the house, who had existential crises at 2 a.m. and wanted to discuss the meaning of life with tears in her eyes. Their balance lay precisely in this, their constant willingness to understand each other. And for a time, that was enough. Isabella had a restlessness that grew slowly, silently, like a plant taking root in the cracks. It wasn't unhappiness, nor loneliness, but a need for more emotion, more intensity, more something she couldn't name. Daniel, immersed in his predictable routine, didn't notice when she began to pull away in small ways, the longer silences, the absent glances, the less frequent hugs. Still, he remained there, firm, trying to hold things together, believing that this phase would pass, like all the others. And indeed, nothing in her behavior screamed abandonment. It was all subtle. It was all too slight to seem dangerous. Over the years, the two experienced losses, triumphs, crises, and reconciliations. They grieved the death of a close friend together, celebrated the arrival of a nephew, fought over jealousy, disagreements about the future, and money, and always made up before bed. They even had a rule: never go to sleep angry. Even on days when they could barely look at each other, they still found a gesture, a touch, a word that would bridge the gap. And that was what made Daniel believe that, despite everything, they were still strong. That their love endured. That it was worth it. He was making plans. He thought about proposing to Isabella, waiting for the right moment, wanting to surprise her with something memorable. He'd even designed the ring with a goldsmith friend, something simple and delicate, just the way she liked it. He dreamed of a small ceremony, in a place surrounded by nature, with a few guests and soft music. He imagined her face walking down the trail, her eyes welling up, her white dress fluttering. He thought she'd like it. He never spoke of it, keeping it a secret. A plan that had been quietly developing. Isabella, on the other hand, began to question whether what she felt was still love. There were days when it was. Days when she found herself looking at him tenderly, remembering the beginning, the reasons that made her fall in love. But there were also other days, those when she missed something she couldn't explain, when she felt suffocated by routine, by repeated gestures, by too many certainties. Sometimes she fantasized about the new, the unknown, the possibility of starting over. And these fantasies, which had previously lasted seconds, began to occupy more space within her. But she never told Daniel about it. She was afraid of hurting him. Or afraid of losing what they had. Maybe both. Daniel didn't see it. Or maybe I did, but I chose not to confront it. I preferred to believe it was just a phase, that it would pass like so many others. He was still attentive, present, kind. He bought her flowers for no reason, sent her loving messages throughout the day, complimented her paintings even when he didn't understand their meaning. He loved as he knew how to love, with constancy. And it was precisely this constancy that, unbeknownst to him, began to become invisible to Isabella. The apartment, once bustling with life, began to grow quieter. Dinners together became sporadic. She began going out more often, saying she needed time to think, to breathe. Daniel didn't question it. He trusted. He loved. He waited. And all this trust, all this silent love, ended up going unnoticed, as if it were his obligation to care, wait, hold her. He no longer realized how much he gave of himself every day. She no longer realized how much she received without asking. Friends gradually began to notice the distance between them. They whispered, suggested trips, new experiences, tried to rekindle the spark that was once evident. But their attempts were lost in the rush of life, in obligations, in unspoken silences. Time began to work against them. And yet, Daniel believed. Because the possibility of it not working out never crossed his mind. Because he believed that love, true love, was made of permanence. And he was there. Present. Firm. Loving for two. Unaware that, sometimes, loving too much also blinds. And it was precisely in this phase of deceptive calm that something began to stir in the shadows. Something that would change everything. That would shatter what seemed unbreakable. That would bring to the surface feelings neither of them knew were still dormant. And when that happened, there would be no turning back. Because once the truth comes out, it cannot be unseen. And love doesn't always survive what's revealed too late. In the first months of that new year, everything seemed to proceed in a strange calm, as if life had gone on autopilot. Daniel continued to wake up before the sun, preparing coffee with the same care as always, leaving Isabella's favorite cup next to the newspaper, even though he knew she rarely read it. Isabella, for her part, was waking up later and later, spending long minutes on her phone before getting up, and walking around distracted, as if she were somewhere else all the time. Daniel noticed, but pretended not to. It was easier to maintain the routine than to confront the emotional absence that was settling between them. He told himself she was simply going through a difficult time, a creative crisis, perhaps something internal she couldn't name. Isabella said she was tired, that she needed air, that the world seemed too heavy. Daniel offered silence, space, kindness. And she received it all with a gratitude that felt distant. The intimacy between them became rarefied, like a perfume losing its scent. Kisses became shorter, touches more formal, conversations more functional. She began going out alone more often, claiming exhibitions, meetings with colleagues, nights of inspiration in places he didn't frequent. Daniel, even feeling the unease building in his chest, avoided questioning it. He still believed that true love survived temporary absences. He still trusted her. But trust, however firm it may seem, is like glass, once cracked, it never returns. One night, he arrived home early after a cancelled event and found the living room empty, with the lights off and no signal from Isabella. Her cell phone rang until it went to voicemail. It wasn't common. She always let him know where she was. He waited. He lay on the couch, but sleep wouldn't come. He stared at the door with growing anguish, while his restless mind began to conjure up scenarios he berated himself for imagining. At 2 a.m, she arrived, smiling, her face alight like nothing he'd seen in months. She was wearing a new coat, one he'd never seen before, and her eyes had a sparkle he no longer recognized as her own. She apologized for her absence, said she'd overslept, that she was with a friend talking about life, art, and projects. Daniel tried to believe her. He wanted to believe her. And he didn't ask questions. He chose to simply watch her as she undressed and went into the bathroom, humming a soft melody, as if she were weightless. It destroyed him inside. That weightlessness that no longer belonged to him. The following days were a series of small, silent doubts, suspicious gestures, and confusing excuses. Isabella stayed more in her studio than at home, avoided physical contact, and kept her cell phone face down. Daniel tried to rationalize, believing it was just a phase, that time would resolve it. But his heart, no matter how hard he tried to protect it, was already screaming truths he didn't want to hear. When she arrived late, he'd say she was too tired to talk. When he tried to get closer, she'd gently deflect him, as if she didn't want to hurt him but also didn't want to give in. It was like living with someone who's already gone but forgot to pack their bags. It was one Saturday morning that something changed forever. Daniel received an unexpected call. It was Isabella's brother. A reserved man, who rarely interfered in the couple's affairs, but who, on the phone, seemed choked with words that hurt just to be said. His voice trembled as he said, "Your wife, she's doing something you don't deserve. She's a disgrace." Daniel fell silent. The world stopped for a second. He tried to find words, but found none. The call fell into a void that hurt more than any confirmation. And then, something inside him broke. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper. An old sadness finally revealed. That same night, without much thought, Daniel decided to go out. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but his body moved on its own, as if it knew the way. He walked the streets aimlessly until he spotted a small restaurant, hidden among the trees, where they used to go at the beginning of their relationship. A place forgotten over time. And there, through the lit windows, he saw her. Sitting at a table near the window, wearing a dress he knew well, laughing at something the man in front of her was saying. They were toasting. Her gaze was the same gaze that had once been his, complicit, light, passionate. Daniel froze. His heart raced, but his body remained still. What he saw there left no doubt. The way she leaned across the table, the touch on his hand, the way she smiled without hesitation. She was a woman in love. But not with him. For a few seconds, he considered going in, making a scene, demanding an explanation, asking what this meant. But then he realized there was nothing more to ask. The answer was right there in front of him, vivid, blatant. It was confirmation of everything he feared but refused to accept. Instead of going in, he took a step back. He took a deep breath. And with the same calm he had when making coffee every morning, he turned and walked away. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He just walked. And with each step, he left behind not only the restaurant, but everything they had built together. Arriving home, he sat at the table and wrote a note in the firm handwriting of someone who no longer needed explanations. I saw you. This is the end. He folded the paper, left it on the coffee table, and left without looking back. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew where I was coming from. And that was all I needed to know at that moment. The next morning, his cell phone rang dozens of times. Messages. Calls. Isabella returned home and found the note. And that was when the despair began. She tried to explain, to say it wasn't what it seemed, that there were reasons, that it was just a moment of confusion. But Daniel no longer wanted to listen. What had been broken there wasn't just trust, but the essence of the love that had once united them. He no longer needed to understand. He no longer wanted answers. He just needed to move on. Time passed. Isabella appeared at her door with red eyes, bringing rehearsed words, sincere tears, promises of change. But Daniel, as firm as ever, simply looked at her serenely and said, I forgive you. But we can't go back. And it was in that moment that she realized she'd lost everything. Because the real punishment wasn't being rejected. It was being forgotten by someone she thought would never leave. However, there was something she didn't yet know. Something that wasn't between the lines of the note, nor in Daniel's silence, nor in the gestures he was making now alongside another woman. Something that would change everything. Something that, when it came to light, would transform not only the pain of betrayal, but the very meaning of the story. Because sometimes, what hurts isn't what's seen, but what's discovered too late. The silence between them seemed louder than any scream. Isabella stood before him, her eyes brimming with tears, but without the courage to speak. There was nothing left to deny, nothing to circumvent, nothing to lie about. What Daniel had seen with his own eyes had closed any room for excuses, and yet she insisted on searching for some crack where she could slip back in. But in the man staring at her now, there was no longer any space. He was there, whole, but it was as if he were no longer hers. His soul had already departed. Days after the note, she sought him out. She knocked on the door of her old apartment with trembling hands, unsure if he would open it. When she did, Daniel looked at her as if looking at a memory, with distance, with respect, but without the desire to relive it. Isabella begged him to listen. She said she needed to explain, not the betrayal, because he already knew that, but everything that came before. She said she was afraid of losing herself, that she was seeking an escape, that she felt invisible. She spoke with words that seemed sincere but felt small compared to the pain they caused. Daniel listened, silent, his eyes fixed on her, but without offering anger or comfort. He simply listened. Until she touched on a point he hadn't expected. She said it wasn't just guilt, that there was something more, something perhaps he needed to know. And then, she hesitated. She bit her lip, lowered her eyes. Daniel, despite himself, felt his chest tighten. It was at that moment that the door opened from the inside. A woman appeared, holding a child in her arms. A girl with big eyes and a shy smile. The world seemed to stop for a few seconds. Isabella froze. The woman, unaware of the tension, smiled politely and said she was going to take the little one to bathe. Daniel simply nodded. But what happened next broke Isabella inside. She didn't know about the child. She didn't know he had rebuilt his life with another woman. She didn't know he had become a father. And seeing that little girl, something inside her exploded in despair. She asked when it had happened, how long ago, if he had been with her while they were still together. Her voice rose, her eyes filled with tears, and Daniel, in a low tone, replied that everything happened later. Much later. That he hadn't cheated on her, hadn't sought immediate comfort, that he had simply let time take its course. But now, this was his life. That woman, that child, that home. Isabella couldn't hold back her tears. She said it was unfair, that she had made a mistake, yes, but that didn't erase everything they'd shared. She said she regretted it every day, that she thought she had time, that she could fix it. She said the other man never wanted anything serious, that he disappeared soon after, and that she realized too late how much she'd lost. Daniel just stared at her. And when she reached out, tried to touch his hand, he recoiled. She said forgiving wasn't forgetting. Understanding wasn't accepting. That the love she destroyed couldn't be rebuilt with tears alone. It was then that she said there was more. That she needed to tell him something she'd hidden out of fear, shame, and inability to cope. She said the betrayal wasn't an accident. That she'd been involved with that man for months before the breakup. That the constant outings, the secret phone calls, the disappearances at night, all of it was part of something much deeper. But that wasn't the worst part. What she revealed next was the real blow. She said the man she'd gotten involved with, was married. And not just married. He was Daniel's wife's cousin. Someone close. Someone who, at family gatherings, had shaken his hand. Someone who greeted him with a smile and a false smile. She said it started as a provocation. That she felt ignored, needy, and that when he started complimenting her on social media, she felt alive again. She said the relationship grew quickly, secretly, impulsively. That they met in remote motels, at exhibitions, on work trips she invented. She said she'd lied blatantly, that she'd looked Daniel in the eye knowing what she was doing. And that, deep down, she thought she'd never be found out. Daniel couldn't react. Her words were like razors, cutting through layers of everything that remained. The secret wasn't just the betrayal, but the depth of the disloyalty. The fact that he'd been betrayed by someone in his own family. Someone he respected. Someone he now knew was faking it for both sides. Isabella said her lover promised to leave his wife, but never had the courage. That she insisted, begged, until one day he simply disappeared. He blocked everything. And she was left there, feeling empty. She said she tried to return because she realized, too late, that no one knew her like Daniel. That no one loved her like he did. And that, ever since, she'd lived in constant regret. She said she thought about him every day. That she cried when she saw old photos. That the smell of his clothes was still in her memory. But now, seeing that girl running down the hallway, realizing that time hadn't waited for her, she understood she'd lost something she could never get back. Daniel stood there, unresponsive. His silence wasn't indifference. It was raw pain. It was the final destruction of something he still carried somewhere deep inside. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm but choked. He said what hurt most wasn't the physical betrayal, but the moral one. The cowardice. The lie told staring him in the eye. He said she could have chosen anyone, anywhere, but she chose someone who knew him. And that made everything dirtier. He said he now understood why she no longer felt anything. Because even the hatred was gone. That the only feeling left was pity. Because she had lost herself in a way that even she couldn't understand. Isabella fell to the floor, crying like a child. She begged for forgiveness, saying she would do everything differently, that she would accept any condition, that she just wanted him back. But Daniel didn't move. He let her cry, without coming closer. It was as if he were burying, there, the last vestige of a past that no longer belonged to him. The door opened again. The woman appeared, concerned about the noise. Daniel simply said it was okay, that he would fix it. The woman returned to the room, and he bent down, looked Isabella in the eyes one last time, and said that perhaps, in another life, with different choices, they would have been happy until the end. But that, in that life, at that time, their love no longer existed. And then he turned and walked in, leaving Isabella kneeling at the door, holding her face in her hands, feeling for the first time the true weight of what it means to lose a true love because of a wrong choice. Isabella couldn't get up. The cold floor of the apartment's entrance felt more welcoming than any words that could have come out of his mouth at that moment. His knees bent, his face buried in his hands, and his uncontrolled sobs painted the picture of someone who, for the first time, understood the true extent of his own fall. It wasn't just guilt, it was despair. It was the inevitable realization that all her decisions had led her to this point, alone, lost, and unwanted by the only person who truly knew her completely. But on the other side of the door, there was no one waiting to save her. Daniel had returned to the living room, where his daughter was playing with toys scattered on the carpet, oblivious to the weight of what had happened seconds before. For the next few days, Isabella disappeared. She didn't send any more messages, didn't look for him, didn't insist. She had understood that any attempt to return would be humiliating, that that man no longer belonged to her, and that his presence was merely an uncomfortable shadow of what had once been love. She moved to another city, tried to start over in silence, distancing herself even from her brother, who now treated her with an almost cruel coldness, as if the shame he had felt at the moment of her betrayal had turned to revulsion. Isabella left the studio, sold some of her paintings, and began living off private lessons and occasional work. She cut her hair, disappeared from social media, and avoided mutual friends. It was as if she were trying to erase all traces of the path that had led to her ruin. Meanwhile, Daniel took silent steps toward rebuilding. It wasn't about revenge. It never was. The woman he now shared his life with wasn't someone who appeared out of need, nor out of a desire to prove he could be happy without Isabella. She was someone who arrived when he no longer expected anything from anyone. Someone who didn't need to promise the world, but who offered loyalty, serenity, love without games, without old wounds. Their coexistence was light. Their conversations were sincere. There was no comparison, because what he lived now wasn't a continuation of the past. It was another life. Another Daniel. One who no longer carried the burden of justifying his own love. Months later, on a random spring afternoon, he ran into her again. He was leaving a cafe with his daughter in his arms when he saw her sitting alone on a bench in the square. Her face was thinner, her eyes sunken, and a look that didn't hide her loneliness. Isabella saw him too, but hesitated to call out. It was the little girl who pointed to her and said a spontaneous, "Hi." Daniel then walked over to the bench. There was no tension in the air. Just a strange tranquility between two strangers who had once been everything to each other. She looked at the girl sweetly, then back at him with a shy smile, and asked how he was. Daniel responded sincerely, saying he was at peace, that things were fine. She simply nodded, looking at the ground. They were silent for a few moments. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, children played around, and the world seemed completely oblivious to the intensity of that reunion. It was Isabella who broke the silence. She said she remembered everything, every day. That she dreamed about him sometimes. That she woke up with the feeling she could still go back in time. She asked if he thought about her too, even if only a little. Daniel took a deep breath, settled his daughter in his lap, and said he did remember. But remembering wasn't the same as wishing she could go back. He said she was an important part of his life, but that now love lived elsewhere. And that, no matter how much he wanted to, he couldn't erase what happened. Not her. Not him. Isabella then explained that she had distanced herself from everyone, that she had moved to another city, that she could no longer bear the judgmental stares, nor her own voice echoing between the walls of the empty apartment. She said she had tried to find something that would make her feel alive again, but that everything seemed colorless. That, no matter how hard she tried, she could no longer connect with anyone. And then she uttered a sentence that disarmed him: "I killed everything we were, thinking I was saving myself." Daniel lowered his eyes, swallowed hard, but didn't respond. There was truth in that sentence, but there was nothing that could be done. A few days later, she went to Daniel's sister's house. It was her last attempt. She needed to say something, not out of hope for reconciliation, but because she carried a guilt she couldn't bury alone. She asked only that he listen to her one last time. They arranged to meet in a remote park, where they used to go early in their relationship. It was a place filled with memories, with images that now seemed distant. Isabella arrived first, sitting on the same bench where they had once shared ice cream and promises. When Daniel arrived, he looked at her with some surprise. She seemed more serene. There was something different in her expression, not hope, but acceptance. She apologized again, but differently. Without tears. Without trying to be emotional. Simply acknowledging everything she'd destroyed. She said she carried his name like a scar inside her, that every man she tried to meet ended up overshadowed by the memory of what she'd had and lost. She said she expected nothing from it. That she didn't want promises, or second beginnings. She simply wanted him to know it wasn't just vanity. That she truly loved him. But that she didn't know how to handle love. That she mistook intensity for absence. That she sought outside what was inside and, in the end, lost herself forever. Daniel listened attentively, without interrupting. When she finished, he stood, walked a few steps to a tree where his daughter had left a toy on her last visit to the park, picked it up, and returned. He said he'd been waiting a long time for that kind of conversation. That he'd had to go through it all to understand that love, no matter how true, doesn't survive a lack of care. He said he forgave her, not for her sake, but for his own. Because he didn't want to carry anger. Because he didn't want her name to weigh down his memories. He said he wanted her to be happy. Truly happy. To rebuild her life, to paint again, to allow herself to start over. And then, before leaving, he left a small envelope on the bench. She opened it and saw an old letter, written by her, never delivered. It was a love note she'd hidden years before, inside a book in the house they shared. Daniel found it by chance days after he left. And he'd never been able to throw it away. The letter spoke of a pure, naive love, of desires to grow old together, of fear of loss. Isabella read it with teary eyes, as if reading something written by another woman. One she no longer was. When she looked up, Daniel was already far away, walking with firm steps, as he always did. And in that moment, sitting alone, holding the letter yellowed with age, she finally understood what she had lost. It wasn't just the man. It was the chance to spend a lifetime with someone who would love her until the end. The park bench remained empty for hours after she left. The folded letter, now drained of its vibrant color, remained clutched between Isabella's fingers until the wind began to disturb the silence around her. She lifted it slowly, as if leaving behind something she still didn't want to let go. But deep inside her, a part of her already knew that this was the end of a story that took years to build and seconds to crumble. There were no more words, no more pleas, no more promises. The love that had once existed between her and Daniel was dead, but mourning existed only for her. He had already buried it. She, in turn, still carried the weight of a body that insisted on reviving in her memories. The following days were filled with a dense silence, but this time it wasn't absence, it was liberation. Daniel no longer expected any contact. And he wasn't fooled by possible emotional relapses. He had done what many fail to do, he ended with dignity a chapter in his life that had every chance of leaving him bitter. He wouldn't become a cold, distrustful man, someone incapable of loving again. The woman beside him today was proof that he still believed in love. But it was different. Now, love came with clear boundaries, with true presence, with mature choices. What he had with Isabella was a love that was lost in the attempt to remain constantly intense. Now, love was serene, constant, and that was enough. On the other side, Isabella faced her own monsters. The separation from her family still weighed heavily. Her brother, though calmer, remained distant, and the few friends she had left maintained a superficial concern, as if unsure how to deal with her. The image of the one who betrayed stuck with her tightly. And what hurt most was knowing that, deep down, she deserved some of that judgment. She couldn't defend herself. She had no arguments that would erase what she'd done. She tried to change her routine, signed up for courses, sought new environments, forced herself to move forward. But there was always a moment, especially at night, when everything came back, his voice, the way he'd looked at her before, the way he'd held her hand when she trembled with fear. It was as if the ghost of the love that had destroyed her visited her every day, demanding something she'd never be able to return. For months, she kept her distance. But life, ever cynical, brought her back into contact with him at a charity event that brought together professionals from various areas of the city. She had been invited to exhibit her work in a makeshift gallery, and he, now working in community management, was involved in the organization. Their eyes met in the middle of the room, and for a second, time seemed to stand still. Daniel was holding his daughter by the hand, and beside him was the woman he now lived with. The three of them formed an image that, to Isabella, seemed unbearably harmonious. She remained in the corner of the room, trying to concentrate on the paintings, but the vision of that trio danced in her mind like an unlived memory, a life that could have been hers. At one point, Daniel approached. He was polite, cordial, and complimented the new paintings. Isabella thanked him with a tight smile and asked if he was happy. The answer came without hesitation, "I'm at peace." There was no further conversation. Just a respectful but definitive silence. And when he walked away, carrying their daughter in his arms, Isabella felt a tightness that was no longer just pain, but also resignation. She no longer expected anything from him. But she still didn't know how to expect anything from herself. It was then that he began to write. Every night, he put into words the feelings that no conversation could fit into. Not to send them to himself, but to remember who he was, what he lost, what he learned. He discovered that perhaps the only possible way to move on was to accept his own ruin. Understand that some choices truly are final. That forgiveness can happen, but that doesn't mean reconciliation. And that love, once gone, sometimes doesn't return, even if both still remember it fondly. One afternoon, she received a package with no return address. Inside was a painting. It was one of her old works, sold at one of her first exhibitions, with a note on the back, "I kept this because it reminded me of you when you were happy. I hope you'll be happy again someday." The handwriting was Daniel's. It broke her, but not because of longing. Because of the kindness. Because even after everything, he still wished her well. An understanding that hurt more than any rejection. It was easier to be hated than to be forgiven with love, and still be left behind. In the following months, their sporadic encounters became less painful. In one of them, Daniel invited her, along with other artists from the city, to participate in a cultural inclusion campaign. There were no ulterior motives. It was simply professional recognition. But for Isabella, it was confirmation that he no longer saw her as an open wound. And perhaps, for that very reason, she began to see herself with less guilt as well. He began accepting invitations, going out, laughing without thinking about him constantly. Not because he stopped loving her, but because he understood that moving on isn't forgetting. It's choosing to live, even with the scars. Daniel, for his part, dove headfirst into his new life. He married discreetly, with only a few friends and his daughter in his arms during the ceremony. Isabella heard the news through social media, and upon seeing the photo, her chest tightened, but she didn't cry. She knew he deserved it. That he'd built everything with respect, truth, and love. That he hadn't trampled on anything. Deep down, she was rooting for him. And that was perhaps the strangest and most painful form of love left, rooting from afar for someone you can no longer touch. Life went on. With scars. With memories. With silences that would never be filled. But, above all, with lessons. Because sometimes, the price of a mistake isn't immediate pain. It's the eternity of knowing you had it all, and lost it. It was late afternoon when she decided to leave home, aimlessly. Her steps, guided by a kind of mild restlessness, led her to an old street, where the illuminated windows of closed shops reflected her fragmented image. Isabella had learned to live with that constant feeling of displacement, as if she didn't belong anywhere. Things seemed to have fallen into place for everyone except her. And yet, there was no longer any urgency to make up for lost time. The pain of her love's loss had transformed into a less cruel but equally present emptiness. An absence that no longer screamed, but breathed deeply within her every day. Loneliness was no longer punishment. Now it was companionship. She stopped in front of a small bookstore, one of those hidden between bakeries and cafes, and went in just to escape the wind. The smell of old paper mixed with polished wood triggered memories she'd thought forgotten. She walked between the shelves until she came across a book of poetry she used to read with Daniel at the beginning of their relationship. She sat in a worn armchair at the back of the store, opened a random page, and remained there for long minutes, absorbing the phrases as if they were food. She was interrupted by the low voice of the bookstore owner offering tea, which she accepted. They talked about poetry, art, melancholy, and, finally, silence. The man, perhaps out of empathy or intuition, didn't ask her anything about her story, and she was grateful. She no longer wanted to explain the pain. She was tired of being someone's mistake. She just wanted to be someone. That same week, she received an unexpected call from a former art teacher, inviting her to teach a watercolor workshop at a cultural center in another neighborhood. The idea scared her at first. She no longer saw herself as someone capable of teaching, inspiring, or leading a group. But something inside her, perhaps a remnant of courage, made her accept. She had to try. She had to find herself again. The first class was chaos. Her hands trembled, her voice faltered, her thoughts stumbled. But at the end of the night, a teenager approached, smiled shyly, and said, "Thank you for today. I wanted to give up everything, but now I want to paint." Isabella left that place with shaky legs and full eyes. For the first time in a long time, she felt she could still transform something, even if it was pain into color. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his life without fanfare. He wasn't one for grand public gestures or exaggerated displays. The peace he experienced was built through small rituals, making coffee for his wife, telling his daughter stories before bed, listening to music while cleaning the porch on sunny Sundays. His love was no longer a promise, it was presence. It was there, in the details, in the repetitions that created security, in the light touch as he passed through the kitchen, in the look that said, "I'm here," without needing a voice. His new partner understood his silence and respected his past. She never wanted to compete with ghosts, and so she never gave up her space to them. She was a woman who knew how to welcome without invading, and love without demanding salvation. One day, during a lecture he was giving on community projects in public schools, Isabella appeared among the audience. She sat discreetly in the back and simply observed. It wasn't to provoke, nor to reopen wounds. She simply wanted to see for herself the man he had become. Seeing him speak with such conviction, surrounded by attentive young people, colleagues who admired him, and a team that gave him a standing ovation at the end, Isabella felt a silent but genuine pride. Daniel had found his place in the world, and it was beautiful to see him there, full, whole. As she left, she tried not to be seen, but he noticed her. They met outside the auditorium, under a cloudy sky that seemed about to collapse. The conversation was brief, but rich with meaning. Daniel asked if she was okay, and she said yes, for the first time in a long time. She told him about the workshop, about the impact teaching had had on her. He smiled sincerely and said he never doubted her ability to transform pain into beauty. Isabella couldn't contain a brief, emotional laugh and confessed that, for years, she'd even doubted existing outside the shadow of what they had been. Daniel then, with his characteristic calm, said that no one is meant to live trapped in what was, that the past serves to teach, not to imprison. And in that moment, there was no judgment. Only humanity. Just two former lovers, now intimate strangers, sharing the understanding that everything, deep down, happened exactly as it needed to. A few weeks later, Isabella received a letter from her brother. She hadn't written in a long time. In the message, he said he had begun to observe her new beginning from afar, and that, despite the pain, he was proud that she hadn't let herself sink. He said he believed everyone makes mistakes, but not everyone chooses to get back up. And that, little by little, he was beginning to forgive her. Isabella cried for hours with that letter in her hands. It was as if her brother's forgiveness healed a wound that persisted, even after all this time. The new beginning seemed more real now. Another weekend, she was invited to participate in a cultural gathering at a center that brought together local artists and entrepreneurs. There would be music, exhibitions, and panels on new beginnings. Isabella hesitated, but went. During a break, walking between tents, she met Daniel's wife again. It was the first time they had seen each other so close. They looked at each other, without tension. The woman approached and, surprisingly, began the conversation with a friendly tone. She said she knew who she was, that she knew the whole story. But that there was no reason for resentment. She said her love for Daniel didn't need to compete with the past, because he was happy, and that was enough. Isabella, overcome by a wave of bewilderment and respect, apologized. She said she knew the harm she had caused. And the woman, with a serenity that dismantled any walls, replied, "You also made him happy, as far as you could. And perhaps, without what you shared, he wouldn't be the man I love today." At that moment, something inside Isabella finally broke free. It wasn't about being forgiven. It was about allowing herself to accept that the story she had with Daniel was real, beautiful, intense, and finite. That the mistake was profound, but that life didn't end there. That despite the pain, the regret, the fall, there was dignity in starting over. And that love, when lived truthfully, even if it ends, never ceases to be love. The difference lay in how each chose to move forward with the parts that remained. On the way home, walking under a clear sky, she took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, she no longer felt a weight on her shoulders. She knew that true love doesn't require eternity, but it does require the courage to not destroy it while it exists. And even though the ending was bittersweet, she recognized that she had experienced something rare. Something many spend their lives searching for. And, remembering Daniel, it no longer hurt. It was a distant affection, almost a beautiful longing. An ending that, finally, made sense. The years passed. Not quickly, but with the cadence of days that carry weight, of silences that occupy space, of choices that shape destinies. Daniel and Isabella's paths continued even after reunions, reconciliations, pains digested in pieces, and even after the past ceased to be a constant memory and became merely a fixed point in time, something that existed, that left its mark, but no longer influenced future movements. Even though on rare occasions their eyes met at events, in hallways, or in life's coincidences, there was nothing there that required words. What needed to be said had already been said. What needed to be felt had also been said. And each, in their own way, moved on, with the fragments that remained and the new features that time offered. Daniel built a solid, discreet, and meaningful home. The woman by his side, with whom he now shared the upbringing of a daughter who was growing strong and curious, was his true partner. Together, they cultivated a life without show, but full of dedication. He no longer carried the weight of distrust, nor the anguish of the past. His peace was built day after day through small gestures, through attentive listening, through a routine that was now a choice. In a special moment, he wrote a letter to his daughter, a letter she was only supposed to read when she turned 18. In it, he explained that love is more than pretty words or promises made in the heat of passion. That true love demands loyalty, and that loyalty is not about not making mistakes, but about not intentionally hurting. The letter ended with a firm and simple warning: never build a love at the expense of destroying another. Daniel became an example not for being perfect, but for not letting pain transform him into someone who would stop loving. Isabella followed a lonely, but not bitter, path. The years didn't give her back what she had lost, but they taught her to bear her absences with dignity. She became a respected but discreet artist. She never again exposed her face in interviews or videos, preferring to let her work speak for her. In one of her most important exhibitions, she placed a large, abstract painting in shades of blue, gray, and burnt yellow in the center of the room. She called it, "That Which Doesn't Come Back." A reviewer asked what was behind that title choice. She simply replied, "Life." Those who knew her knew between the lines that this was more than art. It was the last thing she had to say about the love she lost. One night, now older, she received an unexpected message. It was from Daniel's daughter. She had found her father's letter and, touched by the words, decided to seek out the woman who, in some way, was part of his story. The young woman held no resentment or bitterness, only curiosity. She wanted to understand what happened between her parents and this woman who, so silently, still inhabited the edges of their lives. They arranged to meet at a cafe. Isabella was nervous, but she went. When the girl arrived, her eyes shining and her posture confident, Isabella knew that the love Daniel had built had not been in vain. The girl said she wasn't there to question or confront. She simply wanted to understand. Isabella told the truth, without embellishment. She said she had made profound mistakes, that she had destroyed something that didn't deserve to be broken. She said there was no sufficient justification for what she had done. But she regretted it. That she had learned. And that she would carry that with her forever. The girl simply listened. Finally, she stood up, hugged Isabella, and said, "Thank you for being honest. My father never hated you. But he suffered. Today he's happy. And that's the most important thing." Isabella cried as she watched the girl walk away. It was as if, in that brief embrace, she had received something she'd been seeking for years, the right to move on without guilt. Years later, Daniel passed away. A silent and swift illness took him with the same serenity with which he had lived. His wife was by his side, as was his daughter. His final days were peaceful, surrounded by books, fond memories, and the certainty that he had lived with integrity. At the wake, Isabella was one of the last to arrive. She stood at a distance, leaning against a wall, wearing sunglasses and holding a small bouquet of yellow flowers. She didn't approach the coffin. She didn't speak to anyone. When the ceremony ended and the place emptied, she walked slowly to the grave, knelt, and left the bouquet. She remained there, silent, for long minutes. She murmured a few words that no one heard. Then she stood, looked up at the sky, and left. She was never seen in public again. She left no digital traces, didn't update her social media, and didn't engage with anyone. But her works began to carry subtle messages of healing, rebuilding, and forgiveness. In one of her last written interviews, she responded to a question she'd been asked for years: "Do you still believe in love?" The answer was short but devastating: "I do. But love doesn't always outlive those who carry it." This story is a brutal and necessary reminder that betrayal, no matter how shrouded in justification, is an emotional earthquake. It destroys the safe ground of affection, tears apart bonds, and breaks ties that took years to build. Those who betray don't just take their bodies elsewhere, they also take the trust, dignity, and often the respect that sustained their love. Isabella was a woman who loved, but chose the worst path when she felt lost. Daniel was a man who loved until the end, and even in the face of pain, chose to move on in peace. And the lesson that remains is not just about forgiveness or regret, but about the inevitable consequences of the choices we make. Because sometimes, love even survives pain. But it never survives the absence of respect. If you've made it this far, please comment on what you thought of this story. What would you do in Daniel's shoes? What about Isabella's shoes? Your opinion is very important. Subscribe to the channel and don't miss any of our stories. And remember, this channel does not support, encourage, or romanticize any kind of betrayal. We are here to show that love, when true, deserves to be cherished. And that betrayal is not just a mistake, it's a choice that destroys families, dreams, and people. Always choose respect. Always choose love.